To the fall webinar, and to let you know that today we'll be hearing from Dr. Solon Simmons. This is part of effort on the part of the certificate program to include people in conversations about conflict and constructive efforts to work with conflict. Solon's going to be talking about conflict in America and his recent book, Eclipse of Equality, Arguing America on Meet the Press. I'm excited for him to come to address an issue that has been about the seeming divide, or the real divide that's happening in political conversations in the United States, that has resulted in polarization and strongly identified camps. Solon's going to lead us through a conversation that identifies not necessarily unbridgeable divides, but a missing piece of the conversation, in particular, adding equality into the equation of freedom and tolerance. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Solon Simmons. He's an associate professor here at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, and he's also the director of the undergraduate studies program here. For those of you who are logging in, we're going to be using the chat room for questions, so please, at any point while Dr. Simmons is talking, he'll be talking for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Please do put your questions in the chat section. We'll be collecting them as we go through, and have an opportunity to return to those, and then again ask for them at the end. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Solon Simmons.
Thank you, Mara, and welcome everyone. This is a new setting for me to present in this way, and we'll hope the technology holds up for us and allows for a fairly seamless narrative transition. What I'm going to try to do, I've spoken quite a bit about this book already in different settings, and there are other places that you could go and see, for example, the specific empirical findings, the things, the main stories that I tell in the book, and the things that are the sub-narratives and so on. That, for example, I gave a vision lecture just not so long ago about it. What I want to do today is I want to focus on something slightly different, which is to emphasize the relevance that the book has for the field of conflict resolution, because I really do think of it as a conflict resolution book. It's framed within the language of American politics. It's also heavily borrows on moral psychology literatures and the sociology, cultural sociology literature from which I'm trained. But I think that it has much more general lessons for us, and so I'm going to try to emphasize those things. I'm going to be using this PowerPoint interface. We'll see if everything works in the way that I want. If not, I'll gloss over some of these features. So we're dealing with how can we ensure the protection of a peaceful society and equality for all, which I like this way of framing the issue. So first of all, this is my recent research has been about the television show Meet the Press, and you might wonder, why would someone want to write a book about Meet the Press? It's this old-fashioned show. There are more efficient ways to get information. Everyone Twitters now. Facebook is how politics are done, even in revolutions in Middle East and North Africa. And yet, this television show, which was in fact, which is originally a radio show, is what I would like to say, or how I think of it, is a barometer of the conventional wisdom. If you think about opinion, we often do public opinion polls. We look at various ways of thinking about measuring what it is that people are thinking about. But what we have in Meet the Press, and this is sort of unique for the United States, I don't know if this is true everywhere, but it is true, I think, in the United States, that this is the place where American elites come together and make arguments in public, sharing the cutting edge issues of the day, but within a very tight circle. That is a circle of interpretation shared by the ruling class. So these are, in a way, you can think of this as a critical history of the conventional wisdom going back to the first show is in June 1945 as a radio program, going all the way to the present, and a show which only deals with those issues that the ruling class thought of, not necessarily in a Marxist sense, even though it could be, thought where the ruling class comes together and shares its ideas with itself. Now, they don't do it on the floor of Congress. They don't do it on the more contentious shows. But this is the one place, in a way, where these kinds of open-ended democratic conversations are happening in this very circumscribed way. So it's an interesting conversation for that reason. The way that I did this research, and it does represent 4 years of intense research, and I must say that I watched, read, or listened to every single one of the episodes, which amounts to some 3,500 shows. So it's a long experience of deep data immersion. You can see that, I mean, the work was done in the Library of Congress, and I have a picture here. This is the not the pretty building, but the other one, which is where all the media archives are kept. It was a show that began as a presentation of a magazine. So the magazine was called the American Mercury. It was a very critical, cutting-edge magazine in the 20s. And then the Meet the Press was meant as a vehicle for highlighting some of these, some of the conversations that were going on in the magazine. But what's interesting about this as well is, and I think this is relevant for conflict resolution, when Larry Spivak, who's the founder of the show, started the show, he thought he was having a conversation about the foundation of the United Nations in San Francisco conference. He said, if I could put this on TV, it would make for fantastic television. We take it for granted, but in fact, it was a kind of a democratic experiment that put these justifications in public view. So that's one of the reasons that I studied it. And part of the reason also was it was simply available. You could actually watch this in continuous series all the way back. And it took me 4 years of deep immersion to get the job done. So you get the research flavor of it, because I do think that we are a place which specializes the integration of theory, research, and practice, and that's what you're going to see here is a deeply theoretical piece, but which is, I think, relevant for practice, but it has this research component. Here's one of the flatbed projectors that I watched most of the shows on. You can see it's not the exact version. This is for editing, but basically this is what my experience was like. A very kind of old school retro experience, deep in the archives and bowels of the Library of Congress. So what I'm interested in doing here for us today is trying to suggest how some of the themes that I saw that split American politics, that tear Americans apart from one another. We see this so clearly now. When I started the project, it was hard to say, well, why am I studying conflict in the United States? We don't really have conflict in the United States. This is a mature democracy and so on. Well, now I think it's easier for people to see what we're talking about. We just had Obama can't get his judges appointed. We had the government shutdown. Laws are passed, they're not respected. People try to repeal them dozens of times. We're experiencing a certain kind of conflict. But the kind of conflict and the issues that emerged here in the United States, I think are relevant the world over. And this is, in fact, where I'm taking my project now. I'm going to go global with this idea and start studying conflict narratives around the world. But the theory, what I think I can contribute is a way of seeing. In fact, this has been what I've been focused on for the past year, is just teaching and thinking about how it is that people understand their own conflicts and how well they theorize them. Because I think if people could theorize their conflicts, their plights better, they would be in a better position to resolve them. And that's part of what drives me to do this work. So what I have here are these are two books about the American political scene that have to do with what we call framing. We have George Lakoff's book, which is called Moral Politics, What Conservatives Know That Liberals Don't, which is a critique of democratic politics from the left, based on the idea that the intuitive frames that democratic leaders use don't work all that well. And we also have Frank Luntz, who is one of the great ideologues of the Republican Revolution in the 1990s, a critique in a way of American politics from the right, which also is, it's words that work. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. Both of these are fantastic books, framed on language particularly, and I think in a sense on the superficial level, in a way, of how conflict talk works. How does people think about conflicts? And let me just take a second here to say, that in psychology, I think that the best way to think about how the mind works, and we're starting to see this more and more, is a dual process theory. And this goes back all the way to the beginning part of the century. And you've got a deeply intuitive, quick, hot system which fires quickly and is comprised of images and symbols and so on. And then you've got a more rational system, the rational politics side. And these seem to work somewhat separately. And so those of us, and this framing literature, I think, takes advantage of this and says, well, if you're worried about the rational argument, the rational conversation, you're missing the point. Because ultimately what's going on in politics are these deeper, hardwired symbols, these hot symbols that just saying the word triggers something, and then the interpretation flows. And so both George Lakoff and Frank Luntz think about politics in that kind of very day-to-day, tit-for-tat type style. Lakoff's, of course, got a cognitive psychology perspective. It's deeper than that, but I think in a sense it misses what's most interesting about conflict and the way people talk about conflict, and that there's something deeper than words. There are, if you will, and this fits with our perspective in the Narrative Center as well, there's a kind of interface between these, in my view, this intuitive level and this logical level in narrative. That we see that one of the things that narrative does is that narrative joins the intuitive processing system with the rational processing system in a kind of an artful gesture. And I think it's those deeper interpretations that work both on the level of intuition, yes, that matters, and I'm going to say that how that does matter, why it's so important that we work on the symbols, but also on the rational analytical level where these overt competitions happen. So I'm thinking that what I'm going to be looking at is this kind of narrative interface between, if I could hazard a psychoanalytic turn to Jacques Lacan for a second, the idea of the fusion of the imaginary with the symbolic, the intuitive with the symbolically or rationally available. And I think these happen in narrative. It's deeper than frames. What I'm going to say, so many of you probably know the classic book Pruitt and Kim. I'm hoping that you've seen this book. It's something that we assign at SCAR quite regularly and have for many years. Social conflict, escalation, stalemate, and settlement. And in Pruitt and Kim, there's a classic definition of what conflict is. And I think that although these are psychologists, and they're very subtle psychologists, nevertheless, they use a very, what I would call an interest-based approach to conflict, to the definition of conflict, which leads them into problems. So they say, what is conflict? They go through this dictionary definition, then they say, the term now embraces the psychological underpinnings of overt confrontation as well as overt confrontation itself. In short, the term conflict has come to be so broadly applied that its dangers of losing its status as a singular concept. For us, conflict means perceived divergence of interest, a belief that the parties' current aspirations are incompatible. And I think that's really important because in the idea of an incompatibility of interest, that is a conflict of interest, you're trapped in the symbolic level, in the rational level. These are psychologists, but in the sense they've got a rationalistic interpretation. Instead, what I think is going on in conflict is that there are collective memories of the abuse of social power. And this is what goes back to John Burton's idea of the distinction between a dispute and a conflict. And I think that's essential. It also touches on what people talk about negotiating interest versus negotiating sacred values in psychological literature. But Burton, I think, nailed this. Is one of the things he did extremely well, which is to say that there are disputes which take place, or disagreements, conflicts of interest, within a normative framework. That is, if the parties could extricate themselves from the immediacy of their problems and look at what's going on, they could agree on what is right and wrong. They would disagree on whether this particular thing was right or wrong. We, in the field of conflict resolution, deal with something else, which are conflicts, which is, even if you were to learn more about the other, the more, in fact, you do learn about the other, the more upset you might be because you have no shared normative framework. Okay, that's the important piece of it. And the reason why is because they, sometime in history, maybe recently, probably a long way back and ongoing, abused power. They had power and they abused it. Okay, so that idea of the abuse of social power, the collective memory of such abuse, I think drives many conflicts and make it impossible to come to rational solutions, which is the win-win framework. You can't just negotiate away the interests and come up with rational solutions, I think, in these conflicts. Even in places like the United States, you need to look at the history, the collective memory of the way that people narrate the abuse of social power. So what we need is a way of thinking about what social power is. And if you can see on the screen, I've got this little thing, these parentheses around abuse. So the idea is that social power is something that's good. Power is not simply something that you do, you impose on somebody, but it allows us to do stuff. It allows us to create and grow and prosper. But also, whenever we isolate social power in a setting, we have the potential to abuse it. And that is the dynamic, I think, of the history of conflicts, is the idea that some parties are using power and others understand that they abuse it. So I just want to go through a tour of the great moments of history here. Here we have an obelisk from Karnak Temple, I believe, which is a representation, although originally a religious symbol, became a kind of representation of power itself, the state. And what I'm going to argue is that the obelisk stands for, in a way, the institutional reaction to the problem of insecurity. That human beings the world over have faced problems of insecurity, warfare, criminality, the enemy coming in and stealing and enslaving all of your people, and all the things that come with that. And what the Egyptian state was able to do, and I think that every state since then has looked back to Egypt in a kind of awe, is they were able to impose a certain kind of stability and security. And the obelisk, therefore, has become a symbol the world over of the state itself. So in a sense, as you see what I do there, you have insecurity is the problem. That's the abuse of social power that's in the world. This is the thing that the enemy is doing, the other is doing, the criminals are doing, and what the state does is it protects us, and therefore it has moral value. It becomes a kind of sacred symbol. Now, there are other kinds of social power too. There's the power, once you create the state, and I'll go into this in a little more detail, the problem is once you create the state, now the king or the ruling groups or what have you have power over you. And here we have a picture of the French Revolution, the beheading of the king, and you get the sense of the next great challenge, which is the problem of state power itself. Here's another revolution, which is a problem to the reaction to the abuse of inequality. So once you've got, even if you've liberated yourself from kings, nevertheless you've got great fortunes, the power of the few in their economic enclaves, and this is a representation of Lenin, the classic revolution in opposition to the problem of inequality, Marxist conceptions of inequality. And finally, we have another problem, which I think became clear after World War II, although it was always evident, is the problem of intolerance, bigotry, exclusion. And I've chosen Gandhi in this respect, one, because of the nature of his philosophy. I think it embraced the possibility of transcending this in Satyagraha and so on, but also because India was perhaps the first great example of the demonstration effect of overcoming even the abuses that are in play in a liberal society like Great Britain. So I think that you see these different forms of social power and their abuses. And as I say, we from unfreedom, I know that's an awkward phrase, but from the lack of freedom or tyranny, you get freedom. From the lack of equality, you get equality. And then the value of tolerance emerges from the problem of intolerance. So this is the theoretical perspective, is that there are, in a sense, I won't use the word grand narratives out of deference for the postmodern tradition and so on. But what I will say is that there are languages of valuation that we see in play in conflicts, I think, always and everywhere. We see these languages and these theories of abusive power playing out in all sorts of conflicts, including the United States. So let me just go through the American vernacular quickly. Here we have the American version of the obelisk. It's not an original one, which is perfect for the United States, and it's also far bigger in sort of a grand Big Mac type scale. Ours is biggest, right? Our state is biggest. Well, we also, if you take a trip around the Tidal Basin, as I say, you see the value of freedom, which was interestingly enough developed at the same time as the French Revolution and Thomas Jefferson. You see the Jefferson Memorial. Keep going around. You see the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, who's in a way the great champion of equality. And I think that the way to think about the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt is that Roosevelt came into his own at the end of the progressive era. In a sense, these are the sort of this is the implementation of the great progressive reforms of the progressive era. The 4 decades around 1900 was this great era of let's say social reformation, not social revolution so much in the United States, because there really was no socialism in the United States. But if you look in Germany, you look around continental Europe, you look at also in Great Britain with the rise of the trade unions movement, and also the United States, you see these populist progressive reforms culminating in Roosevelt, who is the only tolerable form in the United States. And just recently we had the opening of the Martin Luther King Memorial, and although each one of these figures stands for more than only one value, obviously Martin Luther King died fighting for equality, for sanitation workers, he was fighting against Vietnam, so he was also, in a sense, articulating the cause of freedom. But I think what was distinctive and unique about each one of these figures is the way they placed the accent on one of these political values relative to the others. So you have Jefferson, Roosevelt, and King as the great, in a sense, founders of discourse in the United States that correspond to those world revolutions around the world and articulate these views. What I should say before I move on is that when Martin Luther King was trying to articulate the message of both nonviolence but also of racial equality, the problem he faced was that people didn't see his movement. They could only see his movement in class terms. So you think about the Roosevelt example. This is a problem Roosevelt faced as well when he was trying to articulate his own reforms. is that Martin Luther King's racial liberation movement was always framed in class terms. So it was understood that African Americans, they were called Negroes at the time, were effectively a kind of a lower class, and they needed, therefore, class liberation, material liberation. And when I think people started to understand in the period after World War II, with Gandhi's efforts, also Frantz Fanon is my favorite theorist in this respect, articulating the psychodynamics of abusive power that comes with majority cultural status, the people started to realize this wasn't about class. This was about something else. It was about identity. It was about culture. It was about intolerance of what were, in the end, alternative ways of living. Okay? And so in a sense, Martin Luther King was crowded out by the two great conversations about freedom and equality in the United States. And many of the political science work, if you go back and look at it, even up to recent times, certainly in the 1960s, pitted these issues of freedom versus equality. The libertarians thought this in this way as well when they developed their own theories of what kinds of what politics ought to be. And the idea of an identity politics, if you will, or a politics of recognition based on the idea of the abuse of power of a cultural majority was something that had to be fought for and developed, and it was originally crowded out. And so what I've done is I've replaced these with, and this is what I'm going to call the Eclipse of Equality, and this is the thesis of the book, which I think is true in the United States and might well be true around the world as well. I'm going to be exploring the extent to which that is true. And I put these different political values under here. I've got liberty, livelihood, and lifestyle, just for a quick alliteration. And you're going to see why I've done this in the next slide. But in a sense, what Jefferson comes to embody is the political principle of liberty. What against the abusive power of the state, okay, the king. What Roosevelt comes to embody is the principle of a livelihood, freedom from want, as you might recall, as one of his 4 freedoms, and against the abusive power of an economic, what he called economic royalists, the elite. And finally, although lifestyle doesn't appear to be a perfect way to characterize what Martin Luther King was articulating, because obviously race is not a lifestyle, but I think that there are deeper cultural norms which drove the bigotry and racism above and beyond simple skin tone or phenotype or those sorts of things that highlight the core of what kind of abusive power we see at play in this last great narrative of liberation, which I think will become clear in the next slide. So I hope that this animation works, but it shows you what has happened. In a sense, what's going to happen, what I'm going to argue that happens in American politics, is that the livelihood conversation, the economic inequality conversation, the material justice conversation fades away, is immediately replaced by a fascinating discovery of a new narrative of liberation, which is the idea of African American civil rights, a powerful, mobilizing story, which was so clear and so obvious once it was finally put into play that in a sense it crowds out alternative interpretations of injustice on the left, which is then opportunistically embraced by the right. And by the right, what I mean is really the old left, the liberals, the Jeffersonian liberals, including many of the Southern racists who themselves were Jeffersonian liberals, who saw an opportunity to switch parties from the Republicans to the Democrats, to push forward a neoliberal agenda, and to take advantage of the space opened up as this politics of livelihood. This class politics fell away in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So here's the representation. Let's see if it works. You see livelihood fades away. The lifestyle, the racial politics comes in, and then we have, in a sense, now we have a very polarized conflict between those who advocate a narrative of liberty and those who advocate a narrative of diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism and so on. I think if I take Martin Luther King out of the picture and put it in its modern formula, it'll be easier to see what I'm trying to say. This is the modern representation of it. I hope you can see it. This is the progression of the eclipse of equality. You see equality, in a sense, livelihood is faded out of the picture. We have the Gadsden flag of the Tea Party, this old 18th century flag, which represents the classic tradition of liberty, don't tread on me. And then on the other side, you have the Human Rights Campaign logo, representing the aspiration still unrealized of of people of alternative sexualities, let's say more generally, to live in an environment of acceptance and respect. So I think it's easier to see that in a sense, when you move to the case of LGBTQ populations, you see lifestyle is more at the fore. It's not about a phenotype; it's about a way of being, which I think is what I think the European sub-Saharan African problem always was. It was really a radical confrontation of lifestyles, but these things crowd out the other alternatives, and you have. What's important about this is you can be a proponent of liberty in the Tea Party mold and have nothing to say about economic inequality. And this is the crucial piece. You can be a proponent of inclusion, multiculturalism, of tolerance and diversity, and have nothing to say about economic inequality. It's actually perfectly reasonable, perfectly viable from a logical point of view that you can have a lifestyle, a racial, a gender politics which does not in any way touch on economic inequality per se. That is, you can still have plenty of poor people who look like the population and plenty of rich people who look like the population. And that's the crucial breakthrough of the politics of our era. Here what I've done is I've just broken this into a chart format. And not to get you too lost here, I just want to say this is what I think is available to us is the idea of what I call full spectrum civilization. Let me just tell you a story. So one of our graduates, Ibrahim Sharkia, was here at ESCAR not long ago, and he had been doing, fascinating guy, been doing studies in Yemen, in Libya, in Tunisia, and looking at national reconciliation processes for the conflicts there. And this is a crucial part of what we do. And what struck me in his conversation when he said, when you watch these reconciliation conversations, what you see is that people don't have a theory of social change. They don't know what it is they're fighting for. They don't know what justice would mean to them. They don't know what the vision of the future ought to be. In a sense, unlike previous revolutions, right? We've just lived through a revolution. The revolution had no theory. Now, we could have a discussion that Mara Shaney and I had a conversation about this. What is it that the revolution had no ideology? Well, in a sense, that's the same problem. That is, if you've got no organizing narrative, which can bridge both those trivial framing elements that I talked about and the deeper principled, rational policy arguments that might actually lead to change, and bring those together in a narrative form, then you've got effectively no forward momentum. That's the idea that I have. And it seems to me that in the same way that the North African revolutions lack a theory, for the most part, people around the world lack a theory of social justice. And I think that if we start to look at the ways in which power can be used and therefore abused and target those things directly, we might do a better job at making sense of it. So what I've done here in this chart is just break out the 4 levels that I presented to you before. You see life, liberty, livelihood, and lifestyle. The life idea is simply what was represented by the obelisk, the idea of the Egyptian state and being protected and safe from the Hobbesian state of nature. What I've also done is that the first column has the political principle. Then and remember that in my way of thinking about these things is that you don't have political principles. You don't know what you're for until you know what you're against. In a sense, these co-create these binaries sort of imply the other. So to posit one is to create the other. And so to impose a notion of a principle of life in a way requires the idea of a violation, of the idea of the problem of insecurity, the abusive power of mobs and criminals and enemies and so on. So the characteristic violation is in the second column, and those are insecurity, tyranny, inequality, and intolerance. And you saw that I said that the equality problem has faded away in America, that the fascination with tyranny and the fascination with intolerance have crowded it out in a sense. And so all new policy options are reframed, recast, not just framed, not just the trivial framing, but are reconceptualized in a way within these larger narratives of liberty and lifestyle. And then also in the third column, what you've got is what I call the abusive social categories. So I hope that some of you have had some political training. You remember your Aristotle and his politics. What Aristotle talked about, what the ancients talked about, was the regimes founded on the one, the few, and the many. You remember this idea? The one, the few, and the many. You had, and there were good and bad versions for Aristotle. There was monarchy. There was aristocracy. and then there was polity, and then the downside of those three things, the one was monarchy or it was tyranny. And then you had aristocracy was a good rule of the few, and oligarchy was bad rule of the few. And for the many, it was the good one was polity, or the word was we aren't exactly sure, maybe we could call it republic. And the bad was democracy. It was the kind of a direct democracy, or they thought of the Greeks thought of this mob rule. So anyway, the idea there being sociological categories which are in a sense universal, that there is a government, there is a ruling group, a cadre, if you will. There are the many people in the world, the many. And then there are the few. There's always somehow processes of social stratification which privilege some groups over others. Okay, so the one, the few, and the many. And then there's this general problem which everyone always forgets, which is the other. The enemy, the criminal, the outside. And we take it for granted that the obelisk is there, that you've got the state to protect you, that we all rally around our sense of identity and self. So that's the sort of basic category. What's interesting about this, and this is where I think it can be useful for conflict resolution, is that these interpretations of these political principles and their corresponding flip side of the coin characteristic abuses or violations correspond to Johann Galtung's interpretations of violence. Not in a direct way, but I think they actually help us to make sense of what Galtung was hinting at when he was talking about violence. So the first two, about life and liberty, are about direct violence. Direct violence from others, fighting, mayhem, what have you, and also state violence. So direct violence in its different forms. Structural violence now takes on a different flavor, because in the end, structural violence is about class politics in a sense. It's about material resources. It's about the rules of the game which will work against you. Okay, and I asked Johann Galtung about this before, and the extent to which the concept of structural violence derived from the concept of exploitation. And of course, he writes about it in his classic article as well. And he said in short form, well, yes, that was an important piece of it. It wasn't the whole thing, but it was an important piece of it. So structural violence, in a sense, corresponds to the rule, the abusive power of the few. And then cultural violence, although understood to be a kind of reinforcement of structural violence, I think it can be thought of in this case as a kind of abuse of status power, of majority status, or in the case of gender, of a kind of a status which has the property of being the majority. That is, men rule as if they were the majority, and they exclude other people. Okay, so that's the basic idea. In a way, the forms of violence correspond to the abuses that could be embodied in certain social categories, and also then therefore political principles anchored in violations. So that's the way the links work. And what I think is interesting is if you go through the history of philosophy, what you see is we have virtuoso theorists, if you will, archetypal thinkers who have addressed these problems in their barest form. Thomas Hobbes is the great theorist of insecurity and the need for a state. John Locke, the Englishman, two Englishmen interestingly enough, then articulates the problem of having a powerful state, which just allows that one person to have all the abuses embodied in himself that was once in a larger array of people. Karl Marx becomes the great thinker of the abuses of economic inequality, and all the various thinkers who react to Marx's model in radical and reformist guises. And then finally, I think that the greatest thinker for me about the abuses of intolerance, the psychosocial effects of intolerance, and the need for, in a sense, post-colonial cleansing is Frantz Fanon. And I think if you look at Frantz Fanon's work, in particular, Black Faces, White Masks, what you see there is a very subtle analysis, using some perhaps outdated Freudian theory, but some good psychoanalytic theory as well that endures, about how it is that the oppressor gets inside your head, and how therefore you need to liberate yourself from the structural symbolic setting itself that values some categories over others. So therefore, if you want a theory, to speak to Ibrahim Shirkiya directly, well, what would the theories be? They wouldn't be Marxist ideologies, but there might be elements of a class critique. They wouldn't be pure security narratives, but they would recognize the importance of having the rule of law and a society that is in some ways stable, where people can feel safe. It wouldn't be purely neoliberal in the way that many American interventions tend to be, but it would also recognize the importance of property, the importance of freedom and of human rights, which, by the way, Locke is the great theorist of human rights, and human rights are anchored in a critique of the state, and I think that we need to remember that and put it right at the core of full spectrum civilization. And then also the identity critiques, the sense of psychosocial revolution, of liberation from the structural norms, the cultural meanings that have kept people oppressed, feeling themselves to be less than others. Those are the kinds of, what I would say are the four dimensions or the four aspects of a full spectrum civilization. I'm going to do this one more way, just so that it's, well, you can't see it, unfortunately. This is a complete mess, but let me go back for a second and just say, what you can think about these things organized in a circle. So if you begin just for a second with life and the politics where people realized that one needed to have a rational system directed toward protecting, us against insecurity. And so Thomas Hobbes and others were theorists who tried to think the nation state in the mid 1600s, in the 17th century. This is the invention of the nation state. In a sense, I mean, maybe it's not the end product, but it is a good idea to have some way of protecting people in their physical bodies. So let's think of that as a sort of beginning point around thinking of it as a circle. Next, we move to the revolutions, and you can even think of this in terms of some people call the 1640s English Revolution, which was a kind of a revolution from the divine right of kings to a rational form of sovereignty. Then you have the 1680s on through the great revolutions of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which are revolutions against tyranny, which are the attempts to ground the principle of freedom and human rights themselves. The Bill of Rights, obviously, an American invention, playing on English sources. So coming around the circle, you've got the politics of life, the politics of liberty coming through history. Then even having secured the state, having protected rights to some extent, especially property rights, nevertheless, economic exploitation is rampant throughout the 19th century. Various socialist critiques, various reformist interpretations like the American progressives and others come online in the 19th century, and you've got another part of the circle coming around, the politics of livelihood. And we do see a politics of livelihood which is not yet dead, but as I argue has been sort of under-theorized and has fallen away in some sense, critiquing the abuse of power of the few. And finally, coming full circle is the politics of lifestyle, which in a way joins up with the politics of life, because if the Hobbesian state was an attempt to protect us from them, and also from each other, this sort of internal them, then what the politics of lifestyle, what the politics of multiculturalism becomes, is a politics of protecting them from us. You see, in a sense, we've come full circle. We realize that we need to be safe, we need to have rights, we need to have livelihoods, but also that we are actually much more diverse than we realize. And those others who have been internalized need protection from us. And so you see the kind of full circle, full spectrum interpretation, grounded, or anchored, I sometimes like to say, imagining floating on a sea, the idea of abusive power of certain social categories, and dealing with those powers in sequence, and not in any kind of simple-minded sequence. I mean, these things are not just rolling out through history in this kind of way. It's much more complicated, reversals, complications, and what have you. But people then, movements, if you will, take their spirit and their sacred force. They consecrate causes, in a sense, like nationalism is a sacred cause for people. Freedom is a sacred cause for people. They consecrate those causes grounded in these interpretations of history and the memories of the abuses. So this is the reason why the Americans use the Gadsden flag. Why do they use this archaic, strange representation, the three-cornered hats and all that business? Well, because they're remembering the great formative moment, the trauma of abusive power of King George III, the liberation of the Americans in the American Revolution, and the principle of liberty in its purest form. So this idea of a circle, and what I call the circle of power, right? Because there are, in a sense, there are these four categories of social power, having to do with each of these sociological categories, and there are also political principles which correspond to them. And so what I call this is the four freedoms in the circle of power. In another presentation, it's very intriguingly represented here, but effectively you've got the four freedoms are represented by the categories. So I wanted to move into wrapping up. So What's going on in the United States today? You see a photo here by a photographer, Brad Pogatets, who I love this photo. It's a photo from, I believe this, I can't remember, he told me it was in Detroit, I think. It was just a warehouse that had a number of these old Living the Dream manuscripts of Martin Luther King. And I think what's great about it is that it evokes this sort of sense of going backwards. Here's a quote from the Washington Post just prior to the 50th anniversary of the March in Washington, which we had the good fortune to host here at SCAR when I was dean. And here's a quote. He said, "I had hoped when I was a young man that we'd see a lot of progress by now," said Mr. Donald Cash, a resident of Columbia, "but I think we're going backwards." And I think that idea of going backwards is exactly the sense we have in the United States, and in some sense, it's absolutely right. Do I have this? Oh, unfortunately. Well, this is what's meant to be, and it's not showing here, a representation of what I call the parabola of pain. So it's unfortunate you can't see it, but what I'd say is if you go and look at Piketty and Sayers, this is what you want to do. These are the economists who are studying economic inequality, income inequality, and what this graph represents is this incredible U-turn beginning. So the data began in the 1910s when they start the income tax, and they move all the way through the 20s and 30s, all the way to now. And what you see, and is the progress of the 10%, the 1%, and I believe the 0.1%. And what you see is that there is a tremendous inequality before the Great Depression. Moving through World War II and after World War II, you see this sort of leveling out. And then after World War II, especially in the 1970s and 80s, an incredible takeoff. Okay, so there's this great U-turn, this kind of parabola of pain, which has everything to do with economic inequality. So in the exact moment, and this is the crucial thing, in the exact moment of racial liberation, in the exact moment when the women's movements kicks in, when Stonewall happens and you have the possibility of sexual liberation, when all of these fantastic liberatory movements are taking place, on the other side, you've got the left out category, the problem of material inequality, of the sort of haunting concept of class, falls away in discourse. You see this in my book, and it's very easy to document this, and loses its narrative power. So people become bad theorists in a way of their own plight. That is, people lose the ability to see inequality itself. Here's another way to see it where I think that this actually works. So here is a sort of a classic income graph where this is income, average income by gender, and you see the horrible story of 70-some cents in the dollar that women still earn with respect to men. We see the injustice in it. This begins in 73 and goes to 2009, it looks as if. And men are now earning 48,000 and women 37, whereas it used to be 1528. And so we look at a graph like this and we say, it's inequality, it's inequality. We see the between group inequality, which, by the way, is that portion of inequality which is in a sense explained by intolerance, right? That men are crowding out and excluding women. Well, what we don't see here is the spread around the lines. That in fact it's getting a lot worse within groups. That is, women are making less. I mean, there's a sort of a long trend line up, which seems to have stagnated. But women are making less than men on average. But there are some women doing extremely well, and many women not doing well at all. This is just the median. Okay, so that is the middle value. And within the male population too, you see an incredible expansion. So you've got the central tendency, which is the between group, which really again has to do with intolerance. It has to do with discrimination. It does not have to do with the mechanisms of power themselves that divide the pie along the supply chain, that give consumers this this deal, that give the retailers a certain deal, the manufacturers a certain deal, the workers for the manufacturers a certain deal, the raw material suppliers a certain deal, all along that supply chain. The deal has been renegotiated. The new deal that we lived through, this period of equality, has been replaced by the old deal. The old deal was get capital, invest it, and do well. And that is what drives inequality, okay? The possibility of this kind of overt competition. And so we don't see within group inequality, which is inequality itself. What we do see is what our stories allow us to see. We see between group inequality, which is not inequality per se, it is intolerance, or it is bigotry and bias, but it is not the universal application of rules which just happen to reward some economic positions in the supply chain relative to others. That's the sort of larger claim, and that's what I document rhetorically in the book. And I just want to end, this is the final slide, and I want to end with this. As I said in the beginning, when you wanted to do race politics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you had to be a class theorist. If you wanted to do gender politics, you started in the labor movement. So the great leaders in these movements cut their teeth, if you will, on Karl Marx and the progressives and the populists and the union movement and so on. So when William Julius Wilson, the famous sociologist, articulated his thesis about race and the possibilities of progress, he said, you know what? If you want to help African Americans today, you've got to de-emphasize race and emphasize instead class, because Americans will organize around class, they won't organize around race. So it's led to what we call targeted universalism. It's like Social Security. Social Security or Obamacare, frankly, will help everybody. But because there's a gap between African Americans and white Americans, that making a universalistic policy that will appeal to the white Americans will help blacks disproportionately. Okay, so that's the idea of targeted universalism. Now, what we've got is, I think we need something else, which is we need an embedded universalism that moves toward class through race, that moves toward class through sexuality and gender. That in fact the left has forgotten how to think about economic inequality, has no good theories that link the narrative, that has no good narrative that link the economic theories with the core intuitions of violation and abuse. And so my final slide is to take this Human Rights Campaign logo and turn it on its side, which is the story I've told many times. But the idea is this, is that when I got this, I joined the campaign many years ago, 2002 or so, right after 9/11. And I got the sticker or the whatever, I think it was a magnet. And I thought, why do they have the Twin Towers on here? You know, this is strange, I don't get it. Because 9/11 was in my mind. I didn't see that what they were trying to say is they were fighting for equality for different sexual groups against heterosexism. Because for me, equality had to do, I was a social stratification theorist. I was studying economic sociology. It had to do with economic and material outcomes per se. And what I didn't see is that this fight against intolerance was therefore a fight for equality. But as you understand, and I think it's obvious, equality is now, when we say that we're concerned about inequality, we're thinking about intolerance. What we really mean is we're worried about excluded groups based on their ascribed characteristics, on things that are written on their bodies that they can't change. So what equality for us has changed in meaning. And that's the basic interpretation, which I want to end with. Because the narrative, in a sense, has changed so much, if you care about the great move backward, the reversal, the fact that we see so much suffering, what we have to help people to do is become better theorists of their own plights. And that's going to require a move to class through culture, as opposed to the other way around, which I think is a pretty fundamental change in our political situation. Okay, so that's basically the story and the theoretical lens that I bring to bear on conflict, both in the United States, but I'm increasingly around the world.
Great, Solon.
So
can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yeah.
This is Virginia Ruby, and
sure.
First I want to say thank you so much to Solon for such a compelling presentation. And as we open it up for Q&A, you can either use the chat box in the bottom right hand of your screen to type a question, or you can raise your hand by clicking on the little icon at the top of the PowerPoint. There's a little guy with a hand raised up. So either way, you can either speak your question or you can type it into the text box. So Rob Eriksson said, quite interesting. It sounds like you see Meet the Press as a reflection of our politics more than an influence on society. Is that right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. In fact, I'm getting a little feedback on this. I don't know how that we could, but I see. So that when people think media, this is actually interesting for those of you interested in media and conflict, is that we look at media and we look at its influence. So how do I get in the media? How do I change the conversation? How do I become a kind of a resolver through media itself? I think, in fact, media can be used in a different way, which is to just learn about the conflict and rather than trying to resolve it directly. So for me, Meet the Press, I'm not interested, for example, in what's left out. You could say one of the stories that's missing in Meet the Press is the gender story. You'll see if you look at my book, there's no story about gender in the book. And the reason why is because there just were not episodes on gender. There were, I can't remember now, it was 20-some episodes that in some ways dealt with gender in any reasonable form as a premise. And that's compared to, say, oh, I don't know, 1,700 that deal with international affairs. Okay, so just no comparison. And hundreds that deal with race. So gender just wasn't part of the story. Now, I could get upset about that. I could say, look, Meet the Press has to be talking about gender, the politics of gender and so on. But what's interesting to me about that is that it says to me that American elites don't care about gender. See, that's what's interesting. It's not so much that, maybe we should, if you want, you could organize around trying to change that conventional wisdom. But because this is a critical history of the conventional wisdom, that is how I use Meet the Press, it's not so much, I'm not interested in the massive effects that it has on its viewers or what have you, but I'm interested in what it reveals about a particular elite conversation. And that's exactly right, Rob.
Okay, we have a question from the John Burton Library, where there are about 20 graduate students at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution assembled. My concern is that by addressing economic and class concerns without exploring the intersections with race or gender, we'll fail to change the reasons those identities are tied to class. That a race-blind class movement will fail to lift African Americans up with lower-class whites. Do you think that's a concern?
I think this is you've hit the most important question, which is the fear we have in shifting narrative paradigms. That is, so for example, conservatives are afraid for different reasons. What they're afraid of with the class politics is that it will crowd out, if you will, concerns about liberty and freedom. And so the concern from the right, and one of the reasons why I think the class conversation, even though, by the way, it's the most egregious situation of economic inequality we've had in decades. It's hard to believe that this is happening. It's almost unthinkable that this could happen and there'd be so little being done. You could have a popular Democratic president doing really nothing about it. He's concerned about affordable health care, and so it's not like he's doing nothing and he has no help from the other side. But he didn't come in to address the economic inequality problem. That was not his main focus. How could it be through this Great Recession, which has turned into an ongoing depression, we do almost nothing about this crucial problem? Well, it's anchored on the right by concerns that if we start to think about these issues, if the narrative of economic inequality starts to become relevant again and powerful and mobilizing, well then, what happens to freedom? What happens to the American idea and the American dream? Well, on the left, there's the argument that you just mentioned, which is, well, what happens then to the movements for ascribed characteristics and liberation on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, and so on? My argument is that those movements, this is what we call intersectionality, by the way. So the fact that whenever we talk about class, pay attention to this. You will always have it paired with also either race or gender, and not so much sexuality, but I guess it could start to happen. You will see it paired. It will never appear alone. The reason why is because, I think in a sense, because what happens is that whenever you come down, when you face your red lines, you've got different red lines, things you won't allow the other person to cross, you're going to need something to trade away. And what we always trade away right now is we trade away the inequality. The fear that I think, let's say that African Americans would rightfully be concerned of going back to the bad old days. The days when the whites, working classes crowded out the African American voter, didn't allow them to vote, passed policies that, for example, Social Security, that didn't allow for agricultural or domestic workers to benefit from it. These are the kinds of race-line policies which are remembered in this bad old way. But you have to remember the importance that, Wilson argued this, and I think it's right, is that class politics today, I say class politics, what I mean is in a kind of egalitarian mood, not something like radical class politics, just some kind of concern about the commons, would benefit women. There is intersectionality. You will, if you have policies which are meant to be big tent, they will benefit women. The union movement today is not the old white teamster that we used to remember as a bogeyman, but it would be women of color in cities. Those are people who are going to benefit from these kinds of movements today. I think that would be a problem if it were possible to ignore the moral power and thrust of the intolerance narrative. But I don't believe it's going to. That is the moral force. If you don't move through that, you will have no left politics. And this is true the world over. Pay attention in conflict resolution. Is anyone really talking about class in a serious way? Is that the main focus? Is that the sort of hegemonic thing which is driving out concerns about identity? Are most of your classes about economics? Is that, are you debating deeply economic policy? If the answer is yes, that you have a different experience than I'm seeing. We are not even talking about these issues. We're flat-footed. We don't know anything about economics. The left has become economically illiterate, handed itself over to the economics profession, and has no serious critique. So I, in fact, think the question is a very good one, and it is the fear that people ought to have. It's, in a sense, exactly that. It's a fear. It's a fear based in reversion, a reversion which I think simply is impossible in today's climate. Anyone else?
That was a fascinating question for me as well. I'm wondering how we bring this conversation into the conflict resolution classroom. As a student or as a faculty member, what are the mechanisms that we can use to promote these conversations?
I think the first thing is simply to accept that there are ways of thinking about conflict which have to do with power, and to start thinking more carefully about power. You know, so many of us are thinking about power in different ways. What appeals to me about this perspective, and it's come to me slowly through immersion in our conversations here, is that when you think about when you take power seriously and you think about its different features, you have different species of conflict in a sense. You come up with different ways of thinking about conflict. And so I think that if we start to see the collective memory of abuse being the thing that makes it impossible to move forward, and start working economic questions in, not simply as, you know, we often do this is the problem. So you say, well, economics, that's just stuff you trade and bargain away. Whereas identity, that's real stuff. That's about, you know, your inner core. Well, that's only because we live in the Eclipse of Equality era, because we have no alternative economics. We have no way of criticizing deeply abusive practices within the economy. So I think simply start seeing bicycles, start seeing class. Use the word class. Why always hide behind structural violence? Why structural violence? Why never class? Because class implies a responsibility. If there are class structures, by the way, there seem to be. I mean, obviously, even if you accept that African Americans are disproportionately sorted in occupations which are not fairly distributed, then you accept that there's a class structure. The mechanism is race of sorting people, but the class structure exists nevertheless. What if we started talking about that? Here's the problem with a pure identity politics. What's the solution? Change your heart. Be a better person. Stop being racist. That's the end. Go out and tell people to stop being racist, and then everything's good, because they're not going to discriminate anymore. They will have changed their hearts. Well, you know what? If you start talking about class, if you start talking about the supply chain and theorizing and understanding where there might be problems in your particular conflict zone, like around who owns the oil, who suffers from the pollution, think about the supply chain and its complexity, and then start to say, that's not just a race issue. Exxon executives are not just racist. In fact, they may not be at all. They could be all African American for all we know, or all global diaspora Africans. But nevertheless, they have an economic interest in promoting what they're doing and not worrying about the effects. So start seeing class in that way means that you actually have to change rules. You have to change something concrete. It's a big deal. And it's where things get really hot. And I think if you start seeing class, you start looking at the way in which these things play out, not just because people have bad hearts, not just because they're bigots, but because they have a material incentive and an ideological apparatus that supports it, then you'll start to be able to work these issues into conflict resolution as not simply sort of bargaining and trading things away when we're dealing with much deeper things, but at the core of what we're up to. That would be my simple way of characterizing how you could start thinking about these issues. Systems, as Rich Rubenstein puts it.
That was a great answer, and I'm taking some notes in the left, so these will be up on our website along with the video from this webinar. If there are any more questions, please do ask them in the chat box, and if not, Solon, are you ready to close?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Solon, for your time, and thank you so much for everyone, to everyone who shared this presentation with us.
All right, thanks everyone.